Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. On behalf of the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement, I welcome you all to a webinar, Global Order After COVID-19. I extend a very warm welcome to our distinguished speaker, Professor Stephen Walt, Professor International Studies, Harvard Kennedy School, U.S., Chair for the session, Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, Research Director of NICE, and participants who have joined us live through Zoom and are watching us on Facebook. We're glad to witness your presence today. We would like to request all our participants to share the live program on their social media and tweet about it. The chair for today's event, Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, is the Research Director at Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. He has been regular and visiting faculty at different universities of Nepal and China. He's also the Senior Fellow at the Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies, New Delhi, and General Secretary at Center for Diplomacy and Development, Kathmandu. Dr. Jaiswal holds Master's, MPhil, and PhD from the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. In addition, he has authored, co-authored, and edited 10 books on China and South Asia. Without any further ado, sir, I would like to request you to please take over.
Thank you, Paki, for the kind introduction. Professor Stephen Walt and dear participants, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I welcome you to NICE webinar on the global order after COVID-19 with Professor Stephen Walt. The Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an apolitical, independent, non-partisan think tank which believes in democracy and a world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflict are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. It is my honor to welcome Professor Stephen Walt today. Sir, we are truly honored by your kind presence. We received more than 1,000 registrations for the lecture from 25 countries. Since we could not accommodate everyone in Zoom room, many of us are watching us on Facebook Live. I, on behalf of NICE and all our participants, would like to thank you for your valuable time. Professor Walt need no introduction. Professor Stephen Martin Walt is a Robert and Renee Belfer Professor of International Affairs. He previously taught at Princeton University and University of Chicago, where he served as Master of the Social Science Collegiate Division and Deputy Dean of Social Science. He has been a resident associate of the Carnegie Endowment of Peace and a guest scholar at the Brookings Institution, and he has also served as a consultant for the Institute of Defense Analyses and Center for Naval Analyses and the National Defense University. He presently serves as the editorial board of Foreign Affairs, Security Studies, International Relations, and Journal of Cold War Studies, and he also serves as co-editor of the Cornell Studies in Security Affairs, published by Cornell University Press. Additionally, he was elected as the fellow in the American Academy of Arts and Science in May 2005. His book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, published in 2007, co-authored with Professor John J. Mearsheimer, was a New York bestseller and has been translated into more than 25 foreign languages. His most recent book is The Hell of Good Intentions, America's Foreign Policy Elite and the Decline of U.S. Primacy, which was published in 2018. Professor Walt, we would like to request you for a presentation, which would be around 30 to 45 minutes, followed by questions and answers. We'd like to request all our participants to drop their questions in the Zoom chat or comment under Facebook Live. Thank you, sir. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak with all of you. The current pandemic that I'll be talking about has been a horrible event for the world, but perhaps the one positive thing that has come out of it is that we've all gotten more creative about using digital media, using Zoom to try and connect with each other. I don't think I've ever had the opportunity to speak to Nepal before, and so I'm delighted that I'm having this chance now as we're all being more creative here. I should say at the outset that my remarks are simply my own views. I am not speaking on behalf of the Kennedy School, Harvard University, the U.S. government, or anyone else. But what I'm going to try to do is lay out what I think the longer term implications of the pandemic might be for world politics, and say a little bit about the world order that we're going to be heading into once the pandemic is over. I'm going to show some slides here, so I'm going to begin the PowerPoint now. And that should give you an idea of where I'm going to go. So I'm going to start by summarizing what my main arguments are, and then talk a little bit about the trends that were happening in the world before the pandemic began. I'll then talk very briefly about the direct impact of the pandemic, because I think most of you are probably quite familiar with what its effects have been. And then I want to start talking a little bit about the results of this. That first, we're going to see a less open world, a less free world than we saw before. Second, that, as I said, it's going to be less free. And finally, that the United States may be more adversely affected than most. And I'll explain what I mean by that. There may be other societies that actually suffer more harm, but in a sense, the relative position of the United States may actually be adversely affected for reasons I will explain later. And when I'm done with all of that, I'll then talk a little bit about the future global order that I think we are headed into now. Here are the main arguments I want to make. First point is that COVID-19 is not going to alter the basic nature of world politics. We're not going to see a transformation of the international system. We're not going to see the emergence of some kind of effective global governance as a result of this. In this sense, it will still be a world that faces certain problems and insecurities similar to the ones we've seen in the past. Territorial states will remain the basic building block of world politics. They're going to continue to compete for power and influence, much as they have for in previous decades. Again, in that sense, we're not going to see a transformation. However, the pandemic is going to accelerate several trends that were already underway before the pandemic began. In a sense, many of the things we already saw that were happening in 2012, 2015, 2018, 2020 are actually being intensified by the pandemic. And in particular, COVID-19 is going to reinforce the gradual shift in power toward Asia and lead to a world that is less open and less free than it would have been otherwise. Again, I think that's where those trends were already headed, but this is likely to intensify them. So let me talk a little bit about what some of the trends were happening before the pandemic began earlier this year. First of all, we saw the end of unipolarity, this period where the United States was really in a completely unchallenged position. I'm thinking about the period mostly of the 1990s, what people used to call the unipolar era. And that is gradually leading to a world of much great power competition. The obvious source of that is in part the rise of China, also the recovery of Russia. You'll remember Russia was really in terrible shape in the 1990s. And as I will say a little bit later, I think Russia is in fact in a state of long-term decline, but it is not in as weak a position as it was in the 1990s. And that has allowed it to be a more assertive force in world affairs than it was back then. I would add two other things that contributed to this, some mistakes that the United States made, such as the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and the 2008 financial crisis as well, which had a major impact on many countries, including the United States, certainly Europe as well. All of this has sort of brought to an end the period of unchallenged American dominance, and with the rise or the emergence of additional great powers, we're starting to see much more rivalry between them. So that's one trend. A second trend is this gradual shift in power and wealth from west to east. For the past 200 years or so, world politics has been largely dominated by the United States or by the European great powers before the United States. Obviously, there was more competition with the Soviet Union as well. But over the last 30 to 40 years, we are seeing the gradual shift, the relative decline of Western dominance and the reemergence of Asia. This is, I think, most obvious in the case of the rise of China, but to some degree, the rise of India has contributed to that, economic growth in Southeast Asia as well. Now, I don't want to overstate this, right? The United States and its Western allies are still, I think, quite powerful, quite wealthy as well. But in terms of the overall share of global power and wealth, we're seeing a shift back towards Asia, in a sense, almost reverting to the situation that one might have seen in 1700 or 1600, when China was, in fact, the world's largest economy. A third trend in recent years has been a global backlash against what might be called hyper-globalization. By hyper-globalization, I mean this effort to lower trade and investment barriers, and to some degree, barriers to the movement of people, and create a seamless, interconnected world that was dominated by market forces at the global level. The backlash against this took many forms. I think the election of Donald Trump in 2016 was one sign of it. Certainly the British decision to leave the European Union was in part a backlash against globalization. The various trade wars we've now seen under President Trump, and the decoupling of the American and Chinese economies. In Europe and elsewhere, a growing populist opposition to refugees, to immigration, a general tendency of countries to want to regain control over their own societies and over their own economies, even if what it means is less economic growth. Another trend has been increased authoritarianism around the world. Back in the 1990s, many people believed that democracy was going to spread around the world, eventually become really the only form of government that exists. People in the United States, for example, believed that as China developed and became wealthier, it would eventually become democratic as well. According to the American think tank Freedom House, 2019 was in fact the 13th consecutive year in which the overall level of global freedom declined. And finally, you see these sorts of trends in places like Poland, Hungary, Russia, Brazil, Turkey. Some have even pointed to India as illiberal, democratic, but moving in an illiberal direction. So in a sense, we are seeing a period in which democracy seems to now be at least in partial retreat in many parts of the world, and authoritarian strongmen, people like Bolsonaro in Brazil or Viktor Orban in Hungary, have become more prominent and influential. The bottom line here is that even before COVID-19 began, even before we had a global pandemic to deal with, the world was already becoming less open, with barriers starting to emerge, less free as authoritarianism came back, and less dominated by the West. So what are some of the effects of the pandemic? Well, again, most of you know all of this. We now have about 30 million confirmed cases worldwide. The actual number of cases is undoubtedly higher. And of course, those numbers go up every single day. When I looked yesterday, there have been 62,000 cases in Nepal, approximately 400 deaths, and the numbers are rising rapidly in Nepal's case. We have about 953,000 confirmed deaths, so almost 1 million dead now worldwide. And of course, that number is going to go up too. According to the International Monetary Fund, the world economy is likely to shrink by about 5% in 2020, which is a huge decrease by historic standards. And we're also likely to see slower economic growth in Nepal. The Nepalese economy is likely to continue to grow, but at a much slower rate than people expected. This has obvious effects around the world. According to the International Labor Organization, nearly half the global workforce is at risk of having its livelihood destroyed because of the shrinking of economic activity. Now, governments are trying to deal with this in a variety of ways. And so one of the things they're doing is, of course, spending lots of money to try and keep economies going. But that means, of course, governments all over the world are taking on much higher levels of debt. And that debt is likely to be a constraint on economic growth in the years ahead. Finally, there were hopes a few months ago that perhaps if we could get a handle on the pandemic, bring it under control, you could get a very sharp, rapid recovery. And in a sense, The economy had shrunk as a result of lockdowns, but once you open things up again, things would bounce back very quickly. I think now most experts believe that economic recovery is going to be rather slow, rather sluggish, and I'll explain why in a little while. So what is this likely to lead to? Well, first of all, I think we're going to see oops, sorry, I need to go back one. First of all, we're going to see a less open world. COVID-19 revealed another risk to these tightly integrated supply chains that had emerged as part of the global trading order, where countries, or companies would parse out their supply chains to lots of different countries, have them very tightly integrated, be dependent perhaps on a single supplier because that supplier was the cheapest as well. Even before COVID, we were seeing some risks involved. Those were mostly political. As trade wars began to emerge, suddenly for companies that were dependent on a supplier, where suddenly they might have a tariff put on that particular good, they were starting to realize that being so tightly integrated to other economies might have some risks. This has simply created another risk, where if a country has to go into lockdown, if you're not able to have the same economic relationship with them, that therefore your firm might be in some danger. The result of this is that countries and individual companies are trying to diversify their supplies, trying to increase stockpiles, and bringing more production back home, particularly in goods that might be relevant for the pandemic, medical supplies, things like that. But also in some other areas as well, not wanting their economies to be quite so vulnerable to political or other changes that are unpredictable. And I quote here William Buiter, who's the former chief economist of Citigroup: just-in-time economics, which was a hallmark of globalization, will give way to just-in-case economics with multiple supply chains to ensure continuity in another crisis. One consequence of that is you won't have quite as efficient a world economy, which means global economic growth will be a little slower, but it may not be as vulnerable to either political or other disruptions. Of course, as we all know, COVID-19 increases the risks of open movements of people. That's why I can't come to Nepal right now to give this talk in person. Foreign travel has been severely restricted during the pandemic. This has obvious effects on the tourism industry, but also on various forms of business travel. And the result is, I think, this fear of future infections is likely to strengthen xenophobia, the fear of foreigners, the concern that they might be bringing disease. It may reinforce racism, sense that different societies or different peoples are inherently dangerous. And I think states are likely to maintain new barriers to travel and migration after the pandemic is over. Online meetings like the one we're having now are going to replace not all, but some business travel as well. So it's going to be a less open world. Things will recover to some degree, but probably not to the same level they were at in 2019 as we knew it then. We're also going to see a less free world. In any kind of emergency, all states tend to limit personal freedoms and civil liberties. Government control inevitably increases. Think of what happens in wartime. Governments impose censorship on the press. They tend to take over greater control of the economy. They impose secrecy laws designed to make sure that secrets don't get out to the enemy as well. And this happens in democracies and non-democracies alike. Well, we've seen exactly that sort of thing happen with the pandemic. COVID-19 has led to lockdowns where governments have forced businesses to close schools, limited what people can do. They've put more surveillance on people in a number of places, imposed mandatory testing. You have tracking and tracing programs designed to spot who might have the disease and might be spreading it. And again, this has happened in democracies and also in dictatorships as well. It's an inevitable consequence of a national emergency. In some countries, leaders have actually obtained emergency powers, giving them the right to override their parliaments or override their Congress. And in some cases, they've eventually relinquished those powers, but maybe not all of them. It's worth noting, by the way, that the record for democracies and dictatorships is mixed. Regime type doesn't seem to be determining the quality of the government response. So we have some dictatorships that have done extremely well in dealing with the pandemic and getting it under control and haven't had a serious problem as a result. There are other dictatorships that have done very badly and in fact have a very serious problem they've been unable to deal with. But that's also true of democracies. There are some democracies, such as New Zealand, that are really the gold standard for an effective pandemic response. There are other democracies, and I'd put the United States or the United Kingdom, that have done quite badly. So there doesn't seem to be a sort of clear pattern suggesting that one type of government is better at dealing with this than not. But I think my bottom line here is that there are many restrictions that are going to be lifted, obviously, once we have a vaccine, once the pandemic is behind us. But some of those restrictions are likely to remain in place, at least in some countries. I wouldn't be at all surprised if I begin to travel again, if you arrive in different countries and you immediately have to be tested. Even after we think the pandemic is really gone. I could imagine going to some countries and being asked to load an app on my phone that would allow the government to track where I was going. This would be justified as a public health measure, but of course it could also be used for other purposes as well. One thing I would note about this whole situation is remember that COVID-19 is not likely to be the last pandemic that we face. It's really the latest in a series that we've seen over the last few decades. There was the AIDS epidemic, SARS in Asia, Middle East respiratory syndrome in the Middle East, and Ebola in Africa. This is merely the latest and the most serious of these diseases. But what that tells us is we're likely to see something like this happen in the future. And that means governments are going to want to have procedures in place to help them deal more effectively with it in the future. Again, the bottom line here is I think that this will continue to make both a less open and a less free world in the future. So what about the United States? Let me say a little bit about where I think this is going to affect us. The United States still has enormous advantages in terms of its economic, military power, its geographic location, the quality of its higher education institutions, very dynamic economy, etc. So I don't want to overstate this, but I think our poor response to COVID-19 has damaged our reputation for competence, for knowing how to respond to an emergency, for being able to act effectively, able to organize both public and private institutions to deal with the problem. That was something I think the United States did have a reputation for in the past, and clearly our response relative to other countries does not show enormous competence in this case. Second, the fact that so many companies are going out of business or are likely to go out of business means you'll have a slower recovery once the pandemic is over. Even if we got a very effective vaccine early next year, it's hard or it's impossible for a company to rehire the workers it may have laid off if the company itself has gone out of business. So you're seeing what some economists call a scarring of the economy. As more and more firms have to declare bankruptcy, have to shut down, it slows the speed with which you can recover once things begin to get back to normal. There's some other effects here as well. American schools are not entirely closed, but many of them are, or they're having to do all their teaching online. And that means that American students are going to make less educational progress than they would have made in a normal situation. Well, that inevitably has consequences on how well trained they're going to be, how well educated, and that has effects on the long-term economic productivity of the country. You also have the problem that when you lock down an economy, when you force people to stay home, when you force people to work from home, there's going to be a greater amount of partner abuse, people who are forced to live together, and that's likely to lead to greater long-term mental health issues as well. And finally, there's some very interesting scientific evidence about how the stress that a mother might be under has effects on the fetus, has effects on children that are developing inside her. And in fact, that when mothers undergo enormous stress, children they are bearing often have greater long-term health problems, lower educational achievement. Well, people are still continuing to have children, and that means we are likely to see some of those effects down the road. The key point I want to emphasize here is that all countries are likely to experience problems like this. The impact or the relative impact will be greater the longer the pandemic occurs, because these are all effects that may occur again in years ahead. And I think this is a problem for countries like the United States or the United Kingdom and a few others that haven't been able to bring this under control as rapidly as some other countries. So again, all countries will suffer from all of these problems, but the longer you have to deal with the pandemic, the worse those problems are likely to be. So what does this mean for global order? Well, as I said at the beginning, nationalism and great power competition were increasing before the pandemic occurred. Those things were already beginning to happen. Nationalism never really went away after all. And despite lots of incentives to cooperate, lots of reasons why countries should be actually working together to try and address the pandemic, most states have gone it alone in trying to respond to it. The United States cut off funding to the World Health Organization. Russia, China, the United States, and India all declined to contribute to a vaccine research fund that the European Union was trying to put together. A number of different countries have tried to protect their own national vaccine research efforts, been reluctant to share information, share data about it, wanting to make sure that if a company in their country was able to devise a successful vaccine, that their citizens would get it first. And of course, we've seen a number of governments, such as the United States and China, trying to blame each other for the crisis itself as well. Now, there have been some signs of multinational cooperation. The scientific community is sharing information to a large extent. The European Union did create a rescue fund to help various European economies. So there have been some signs of multinational cooperation, but by and large, this has been every state for itself. Again, doesn't particularly surprise me. It's one of the reasons I think this is not going to be a transformative event in world politics. And let's not forget that even in the midst of this enormous global event, conflicts are continuing in many parts of the world, in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, Ukraine. We've had a border clash between India and China. Continued internal violence in Sudan and many other places. None of those things have ended as a result of COVID-19. So what is the future global order likely to look like? Well, again, it's going to be an intensification of many of the trends we saw happening before the pandemic began. They will be, in my view, defined primarily by a rivalry between the United States and China, especially centered around Asia. I believe that China would like to have a dominant position in Asia, by which I don't mean it's going to try and conquer all of Asia, but rather it wants to be in essentially an unchallenged position there where it doesn't have to worry about security in its immediate neighborhood. That's something every great power wants if they can get it. And what that means is that over time, I believe China would like to push the United States out of Asia, weaken or eliminate the security ties between the United States and countries like Japan, the Philippines, Australia, possibly India, and some others. Of course, the United States would like to remain connected to those countries and make sure that China is not in a position to dominate Asia for a variety of reasons of its own. And that means we are likely to see a very intense competition between the United States and China, a competition for influence focused at least in the near to medium term around Asia itself. Among other things, I think that means that many countries in Asia and in other parts of the world may eventually have to, in a sense, pick a side, decide which side they are likely to be on. And we may even see that emerging over things like the digital world, where in a sense there's one China-centered internet, possibly using Huawei technology and various Chinese applications, and another segment of the internet that is more Western-oriented, using American or other technologies there. That appears to be the direction we're headed now. This has sometimes been called the creation of a splinter net, where the world begins to separate into separate digital domains. I think we're likely to see something like that certainly happening in terms of geopolitics. As for Europe, I think Europe is going to be preoccupied, as it has been, with internal issues, with the issues of its immediate neighborhood, Ukraine, North Africa, the emerging dispute between Turkey and Greece over territorial claims in the Mediterranean. So Europe is going to still be, I think, primarily focused on European affairs or its immediate neighborhood. It's interesting, last week, the EU foreign minister, Josep Borrell, said that Europe must begin to chart its own way, and he said explicitly to avoid being squeezed between the United States and China. I think that clearly that's something Europe would like to avoid, but I think the European countries are not going to be able to remain neutral between the United States and China and at the same time still rely on American protection. I think that's not going to be politically possible. So they may have to decide how they're going to line up as well. Russia will continue to decline relative to other powers. It's worth remembering that Russia's economy is in fact smaller than that of Italy's. Italy has a larger GDP than Russia does. So Russia is not an economic superpower at all. It will continue to have a certain amount of influence in its immediate neighborhood, largely based on military power, to some degree on its gas exports. But I think over time, we're going to see Russia be very much a far weaker great power than the United States or China. And as I said before, overall, power and influence continues to shift in the direction of Asia. But again, that's just as it was doing before the pandemic. It may do so a little bit more rapidly as a result. Bottom line here is that the risk of a great power conflict, in my view, is increasing. The optimism with which many of us greeted the 1990s, this idea that great power rivalry was really a thing of the past, that we had reached the end of history and one wouldn't have to worry about those things in the future, I think turned out to be far too optimistic. And what we're seeing is a return to the kind of familiar patterns of great power rivalry that we've seen in the past. But there are still a number of areas where cooperation is really essential. And one of the major challenges is going to be trying to preserve those areas of cooperation, even in the midst of heightened great power competition. I mean, the most obvious one, of course, is trying to get and bring this current pandemic to an end and then being better prepared for dealing with future ones. That's going to involve a certain amount of international cooperation, both now, but more importantly, to be better prepared the next time some virus decides to jump from one species to humans. An area where no matter how bad things get among the great powers, where we all have an incentive to actually work together is ending COVID-19 and preventing another thing like this happening again. Second obvious area for cooperation is climate change, which will affect all parts of the planet in different ways, and none of them in a beneficial way. And again, if you don't get cooperation among the major greenhouse gas emitters, that's the United States, China, India, some countries in Europe, Russia, etc., this problem is not going to get solved. And you're not going to be able to do that unilaterally. The United States can't do it by itself. India can't do it by itself. China can't do it by itself. Japan can't do it by itself. So that's an area where if we care about the planet, we're going to have to work together regardless of what's happening elsewhere. Improving nuclear security. And by nuclear security, I mean both trying to control nuclear proliferation, the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries, but also trying to make sure that the existing stockpile of nuclear weapons around the world never gets used. Weapons do not get stolen, nuclear material doesn't get diverted to non-state actors and things like that. And that's, again, another issue where Russia, China, the United States, and others all actually have similar interests. Whatever their political relationship might be, they have an interest in making sure that nuclear weapons are reliably controlled. Increasingly, I think reforming the World Trade Organization is seen as an imperative. That it was perhaps useful for a number of years, but is badly outdated, doesn't deal with many of the important issues on the global trade agenda, doesn't handle technology particularly well, doesn't handle digital markets particularly well. And so coming up with new rules for global trade and investment, obviously these have to be rules that everybody agrees to, is I think going to be an important priority if we want to maintain a productive and growing world economy. And closely related to that, I think, is going to be trying to develop, if not a formal set of treaties, at least some well-established norms of conduct in cyberspace. What sorts of activities are permissible for governments to engage in that world, and what are activities that might harm others that they agree not to engage in, and come up with, again, a kind of rules of the road to govern the digital world as well. My bottom line here, though, is that, perhaps the biggest challenge that we are going to be facing in the years ahead is to preserving the various benefits, the joint gains from cooperation among even countries that might be rivals in other ways in an era of rising competition. This is, I think, going to be an extraordinary challenge. It's very easy to allow relations to spiral down into increasingly hostile, increasingly suspicious relations, where it becomes almost impossible to do anything together because that's seen as so unpopular in one's own country. So again, as I look out at the next 10 to 15 years, I think the biggest challenge for creating a more benign or beneficial world order will be to preserve cooperation in the areas I've identified here on this slide, while at the same time relations in other areas become more conflictive. And on that happy note, I will simply say, if you want to know more, that's a way of getting my views on where the world is. That's a copy of my recent book, and hopefully some of you have read it or will have the opportunity to do so. Let me stop there. I will stop my screen share and look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you, Professor, for the enlightening, interesting, and very comprehensive presentation. We get to learn a lot. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. It is really an honor to listen to you, though virtually here in Nepal. We hope to see you in real in days to come in Kathmandu. Thank you very much. Professor Walt, we have received around 80 questions, and we're expecting more because the presentation is over now. So without much delay, let me start with the questions. The first question is, what will be the role of China after COVID-19? How will the balance of power between US and China turn out post-COVID era? I'm clubbing all the questions related to China. And third is, how COVID-19 will change China's relation with the rest of the world?
So I don't think it's going to have a dramatic effect on China's relations with the rest of the world, in the sense that it may have changed it a bit at the margins, but China's relations with the rest of the world will continue on more or less the same trajectory they were on. I'll say 2 or 3 things about this. I mean, there's no question that China's economic development over the last 30 to 40 years has been extraordinary, really quite remarkable development. For a long time, of course, that was handled under Deng Xiaoping's doctrine of a peaceful rise. The idea that China would concentrate on developing internally and not play an overly active role on the world stage, not develop a lot of military power, not throw its weight around in various ways. Under Xi Jinping, I think the philosophy of a peaceful rise has been abandoned now, and China is beginning to use its increased power and wealth to try and reshape global politics in ways that are it sees as being in its interests. I don't find this, evil, wicked, or surprising. This is what major powers do. As countries become more powerful, they want more influence. They want the way the world is ordered and run to reflect their interests more. Not surprisingly, however, that has affected how other countries view China. And I think it's been compounded in recent years by a more assertive, some would even say aggressive diplomatic style, which again has alarmed a number of other countries as well. So we're seeing states in Asia be more concerned about how China is using its power. You've certainly seen the United States over the last 15 or 20 years become increasingly concerned about this and begun to take growing steps to try and counter it in a variety of ways. And you're even seeing in Europe, which 10 years or so ago was, I think, quite welcoming to Chinese investment, Chinese commercial relations, et cetera, to be more wary of this, and in some sense, even shifting towards a more anti, or at least wary of China position. So I think there's no question China is going to be easily the second most influential and powerful state in the world. But with that, it isn't just one of making other countries, welcome this. The nature of world politics is as you become more powerful, you get more influence, but you also get, in some cases, more resistance, precisely because others worry a great deal about how your power is likely to be used.
Let me move to the next question. What would be the future of U.S.-Israel relations under Joe Biden's presidency?
Under Joe, the question is, what is the future of U.S.-Israel relations under Joe Biden's presidency? I do not think you're going to see a substantial change in U.S. policy towards Israel under a Biden presidency. Biden has always been a very strongly pro-Israel politician. That's not to say he wouldn't be willing to make some criticisms of Israeli policy in certain cases. I think, for example, a Biden presidency would oppose any Israeli attempt to annex portions of the West Bank, but I do not believe a Biden presidency would put enormous pressure on Israel to finally give the Palestinians a state of their own, or to alter its policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians. In that sense, I think a Biden presidency will not be that different than either the Trump presidency or the Obama presidency, or any of the predecessors, where Americans were occasionally critical of Israel, but would never do anything to actually alter the close relationship of support.
Thank you, sir. The next question is on Japan-China. Is it possible for Japan to join hands with China to secure regional security?
Yes and no. I don't believe that the two states will form an alliance. I don't believe, I think there's always going to be a certain wariness, a certain concern about what each other is doing. And there are some specific issues where they have real conflicts, territorial disputes in the East China Sea, Sea of Japan, etc. That said, one hopes that that China and Japan will work on those problems in a constructive fashion. So I think they're going to be rivals to some degree. They're going to be wary of each other. I think Japan is going to remain closely aligned with the United States, but that doesn't mean that the relationship is necessarily going to be one of intense conflict. A lot of this, I think, also depends on what the American approach towards that part of the world is and how actively engaged the United States is not only in managing its relationship with Japan, but also its other allies in Asia. But I don't believe you're going to see a sort of close partnership between Tokyo and Beijing to try and manage security relations in Asia.
The next question is on Indo-Pacific. How do you see the changing power dynamics in the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, I've already alluded to most of this, and let me expand on it a little bit. I mean, the obvious change over the last 20 or 30 years has been China's emergence as a major power, both economically, but also increasingly militarily. And, quite consistent with the way I think world politics works, that has produced a certain degree of balancing behavior on the part of other countries in Asia. Where you see a growing relationship between the United States and India. You see the so-called quadrilateral partnership emerging among India, Japan, Australia, and others. You see countries like Vietnam wanting to be closer to the United States than they have in the past. I think this is all very familiar sort of balance of power politics working itself out in the Asian context. What's interesting about this, of course, is that the coalition of countries that are concerned about China and its possible actions in Asia is a somewhat unwieldy coalition. The geographic distances are enormous, say from India all the way to Japan. These are countries that have security concerns about China, but they also want to maintain a close economic relationship with China. Some of these countries, like South Korea and Japan, have a difficult relationship for historic reasons as well. So holding this coalition together is not always easy. And for me, that means there's actually a real role for American leadership, primarily diplomatic, to manage relations among various countries in Asia that are concerned about China. Some of this also depends on Chinese actions. It seems to me the more that China throws its weight around, the more that it does things that clearly alarm other countries, the stronger the reaction against China is likely to be, the more these countries are going to want a partnership with the United States. So if you ask me sort of what's happening in the Indo-Pacific region, I would say you have a more powerful and more assertive China that is provoking a defensive reaction among many countries in Asia and also from the United States.
So next question is on multilateral institutions. How do you see any possibility that after pandemic, multilateral institutions see constructive changes, particularly in funding and agenda setting?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last word. In funding and
multilateral institutions see constructive changes, particularly in funding and agenda setting.
Yeah, I'm not hearing the last word, but
agenda setting of agendas. Yes.
Got it. Thank you. That's a great question, and I'm not sure I have a really good answer for it. As I indicated, there are going to be some areas where you can't really address the problem without a multilateral agreement, and that's most obvious in the case of trade and investment, that you need a set of rules to manage the global trading order. And we had a set of rules under the World Trade Organization that the vast majority of countries in the world had signed up to. That set of rules has been breaking down in a variety of different ways. And a number of different countries, including the United States, are partly responsible for that breakdown. But I do think if you want to maintain a fairly integrated global economy, we're going to have to develop a new set of rules, a new set of norms, and that will be more effective if it's done on a multilateral basis. I think we also know from the past 50 or 60 years of trade negotiations is that that's not easy to do. that getting everyone in the world, or most countries in the world, to accept a particular framework, a particular set of norms and procedures is a very time-consuming process. It took at least a decade to negotiate and ratify the WTO around the world as well. But I don't see an alternative to doing that on a multilateral basis. The other area that is obviously where if you don't have perfect multilateralism, you're going to need a lot of buy-in by lots of different countries, is climate change. Again, the United States has been an obstacle in that regard under the Trump administration. It was much better under the Obama administration. And I think, by the way, if Joe Biden becomes our next president, you'll see the United States take climate change seriously again, as it should. But that's another area where obviously you can't just do this on a unilateral or even a bilateral basis. You know, if the United States and China reach an agreement, that would be good, but it has to include more than just those two countries. And then the final area where I would hope to see multilateral engagement and agenda setting is global public health. You know, the past 8 months, if nothing has taught us that we need a more effective way of dealing with global public health problems like a pandemic, you know, I don't know what else we need, because if we don't want to go through something like this again in 5 years or 10 years, we need to then start planning and preparing so that different countries, you know, share information, have responses in place, and when something like this happens again, it's dealt with much more effectively than we did this time around.
Let me move to the next question. It is from your book, The Origins of Alliance, which said that states form alliance primarily to balance against threats. Threats in turn are a function of power, geographic proximity, offensive capabilities, and perceived intentions. It is from a famous book, The Origin of Alliance. So the question, like many small countries in Asia have alliance with big powers near and far. How do you think is the best way for a small country like Myanmar or Nepal or Bhutan to escape from political dilemma because of big power competition?
The bad news is I don't think small states can escape from the realities of big power competition. That when you know, major powers are seriously at odds, this shapes the entire environment in which other countries have to operate. What we've seen in previous great power rivalries is that, yes, smaller states can try to maintain neutrality, and sometimes that works, not always. Sometimes they can line up with whichever great power they think is going to be a better source of protection. That, in my view, usually means lining up against whoever they regard as most threatening, and trying to make sure they're on good terms with other great powers that can help protect them. But I don't think there's a way of escaping this particular problem. And for countries like Myanmar, for Cambodia, for Vietnam, for other states in Southeast Asia, navigating the growing tensions between the United States and China is going to be a real challenge. I do think, what all of these states should do, of course, is try to maintain connections to both sides. Make it clear that they would like to see the competition be as muted as possible, that they don't want to see that rivalry get so far out of control that they are forced to either make a choice or are damaged by the consequences in various ways. But the bad news is I think the resources available to the smaller states here are going to be relatively limited, and their ability to sort of walk that fine line between two contending great powers is going to be somewhat limited.
Let me move to the next question. How do you see the Israel's foreign policy towards Middle East changing?
Well, there have been some obvious important events in recent years, or in recent months, the most obvious being the establishment of diplomatic relations and eventually economic relations between Israel and several Gulf states, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain in particular. And this is being hailed as a remarkable development because it's really almost the first case of Arab states recognizing Israel. Now, it's worth remembering that two other Arab countries had done so previously, Egypt and Jordan. So it's not in that sense a complete sea change or anything like that. But this is seen as a major development. I actually think it's not irrelevant, but it is not all that significant. And I'll say why. First of all, these were countries that were already cooperating with Israel in a number of different ways in a rather quiet, under-the-table fashion. But everybody knew that this was going on. There was some amount of intelligence cooperation. They were coordinating policies, mostly all of it inspired by their mutual concerns about Iran. And in that sense, it's another example of balancing behavior. So in that sense, what these recent announcements do not connote any major sea change, major change in the actual relationship. It's really just being publicly acknowledged. The second reason it's not that significant is these were countries that weren't at war with Israel. The UAE had never fought Israel. Israel had never fought the UAE. So in a sense, it's a peace agreement between two countries that weren't at war to begin with. And then the final thing that I think is not, why it's not that significant is it doesn't change the central problem that Israel faces, which is still what is it going to do with the Palestinian population that it controls, right? And what I think has happened here is we've moved even closer to essentially a one-state solution for all practical purposes. And a one-state solution means that Israel will continue to control the lives of millions of Palestinians in perpetuity. And I do not think that's a sustainable position, all right? That at that point, Israel ceases to be a genuine democracy and becomes, in effect, something of an apartheid state. And there, that's the trend we've been on. That's been the stated objective, it seems to me, of the Israeli right for a long time. And this set of agreements doesn't change any of those realities. So in a sense, it moves us closer to a one-state solution, which has its own set of problems, and those agreements don't do anything to solve those problems.
The next question is on World Health Organization. Has the role of World Health Organization and the protectionist attitude of United States given rise to vaccine nationalism and greater emphasis to unilateralism?
The short answer is yes, although I think it's not unique to the United States, that we've seen a number of different countries who are working on vaccines be more concerned to sort of win that race themselves than to make sure the world wins that race, and more concerned that they get either credit for the breakthrough or can provide for their own citizens first and the rest of the world later. So yes, the American position has reinforced that, but the United States is not unique in that regard.
Another question is on Iran. Iran has seen its one of the most worst times while dealing with COVID-19 in the wake of already economic and other sanctions imposed by United States. Is there any hope of Iran getting closer to the United States in any manner?
Yes, but it would involve changes in both the United States and in Iran that one can't be confident about. So I believe the Obama administration and the Rouhani government in Iran were both attempting to do that. That the nuclear agreement, the so-called Joint and Comprehensive Plan of Action, was supposed to be the first step. That we were going to have essentially a 15-year agreement that would take the nuclear issue off the table and then allow the two countries to start working on the other issues that divided them, most of them involving regional security issues in the Middle East as well. And the hope, I think, in the Obama administration, but also in the Iranian government under Rouhani, was that this process of de-escalating the conflict could begin. Maybe it wouldn't work, maybe it wouldn't succeed, but the nuclear deal was intended to be the first step towards Iran normalizing its relations with the rest of the world, including the United States. Now, as you know, that didn't happen. Donald Trump got elected, eventually walked away from the nuclear deal. Iran has resumed some, not all, but some of its nuclear activities. And we've had a series of confrontations with Iran under the Trump administration. So in a sense, it's gone exactly the opposite direction. I could imagine a Biden administration not going back to exactly the policies that the Obama administration followed, but attempting to resurrect some new version of the nuclear agreement, again, to keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, and then perhaps seeing if this process of thawing could begin. But remember, it has really politically influential opponents in the United States, and there are politically influential opponents of rapprochement or détente within Iran. So it is not something that's going to happen overnight. It's not something that would be easy, it seems to me, for either country, even though I think it would be beneficial for both if they had a more normal relationship that was much less contentious.
We have another question on COVID-19 pandemic. Like the COVID-19 pandemic is reshaping geopolitics. Escalating tensions between the United States and China are the clearest immediate outcomes. But what are the long-term impact?
Well, I was trying to answer some of that in my talk, but I'll just reiterate a couple of points. I mean, first of all, rivalry between the United States and China didn't begin in 2020. It was already emerging, 15 or 20 years ago, and has, I think, done nothing but accelerate and intensify in many areas, not in all areas, because the two countries have also cooperated on a number of issues as well. COVID-19 has accelerated that process, but it didn't begin it, and it's not the fundamental basis for it. In terms of the long term, I've suggested that the American response has undermined the American position in a variety of ways. Again, it's made us look less competent. It's likely to have longer term effects on the United States than it will on China, although its effects on China have not been positive either. But in a sense, I guess, if we go 10 years down the road, say 2030, I don't think we will look back on COVID-19 as a fundamental turning point in the relationship between the United States and China, an inflection point where suddenly the trajectory altered. I think it was headed in a particular direction before then, and it's going to be headed in that same direction 2 years from now, if we finally have COVID-19 well behind us. Some of it will also depend, I might add, on sort of how each society comes out of it. If the United States is able to develop a vaccine first and deploy it effectively and get its own economy sort of back rolling, that will be good for America's position. If that doesn't happen, and instead it's China that comes out of this more rapidly, it seems to have known what it was doing, that will enhance China's image in the world to some degree, even at the same time as it probably reinforces some concerns about what China will do with an improved geopolitical position.
Another question, you might have answered this as well, but if you want to add some more, because you were talking about decoupling of the economies. So US is talking of decoupling of its economy with China. Is it possible, or it's just a pre-election propaganda of United States?
I don't think this is propaganda at all. I don't think the United States wants to decouple entirely. There are lots of ways in which we benefit from trade with China, and China benefits from that same relationship. And there are clearly, business interests in the United States that want to maintain those economic ties. That said, I think that in certain areas, and those are areas in primarily involving advanced technology, artificial intelligence, 5G, etc., the United States is now playing real hardball. And some of this is a reaction to policies that China has followed in the past that we've been willing to tolerate, even though we didn't like them very much, having to do with the rules by which foreign investment come into China, the handling of intellectual property and patents and things like that, the espionage that Chinese firms have engaged in the United States. So in that, the United States, I think, is not engaging in propaganda here. They are making a very serious effort to make sure that in certain areas of technology, China doesn't dominate. And the United States is in a position right now to put enormous pressure on China. Now, what that means over the longer term remains to be seen. I don't think anyone should underestimate what China may be able to do. At the same time, I think it's also important to not sort of pretend that China is a magical power that can do anything it wants. China faces quite substantial problems of its own that they may be able to deal with, may be able to address, but it's not as though China is this unstoppable force that can magically achieve any goal it sets before us. And I think there's a tendency occasionally in the United States to sort of view it that way, which is in my view, quite wrong.
So the next question is on India. What role India can play in the post-COVID scenario?
I mean, it sort of depends a little bit on what area of global politics one is talking about. India has, I think, enormous potential of its own and has made substantial progress in the last couple of decades. Not as much as I think many people had hoped, but quite impressive. And I think what we've seen as China has risen, we've seen the United States and India, which have always had a slightly guarded relationship, which itself is somewhat interesting. But I think that guardedness has decreased somewhat, and we've seen the two states, not surprisingly, begin to collaborate in a variety of ways. I am not an expert on India, so I try not to say, go beyond my level of knowledge. But I would say that I think for India, most of the most serious challenges are, in fact, internally. Have to do with the relationship between Hindus and Muslims within India and with various reforms that are needed to ignite the full economic potential of India as a country. That yes, India has various sort of foreign and security problems, including a deteriorating relationship with China, but the solution for many of them is what it's able to do to increase its economic strength and overall unity at home. This is sort of by the way, my view of what is true of many major powers, that what they do inside, what they do in their own country is at least as important as what they might be able to do in foreign policy or vis-a-vis other countries. We often think that the national success is determined by what you're able to do on the global stage, by some great foreign policy agreement or victory or triumph in a war or whatever. But in fact, what makes major powers what they are is their ability to organize their populations in a sort of productive and unified way. So in a sense, the key to success is as much you do at home as it is what you do with others.
Let's move to Russia. Where do you place Russia and Russia-China relations in the post-COVID world?
I think what happens vis-a-vis Russia depends a lot on what other countries do in this regard. If I imagine the post-COVID world being a sort of very lopsided multipolar order with the United States and China at the top. In my view, I think the United States will still be ahead, but those are going to be the two most important countries in the world. followed by some other countries, of which Russia, India, Brazil, Germany are well behind the United States and China. And in Russia's case, their position is going to get weaker and weaker over time because they have not been able to modernize their economy. They're still too dependent on, oil and gas exports, things like that. They also have some serious demographic problems, an aging population, a population that is likely to decline in number over time as well. China and Russia are not natural allies. They share a long border. They have had historic problems in the past. And in my view, one of the things that has pushed pushed Russia and China closer together have been American policies, things like NATO enlargement, some of the actions we've taken in the Middle East and elsewhere. It's not to defend Vladimir Putin at all, but it seems to me from an American perspective and from a European perspective, finding some way to unwind the current spiral between Moscow and its neighbors and the United States would be a good thing. That in an attempt to, if not driving Russia and China apart, at least loosening up that relationship would be good for the United States. It would be good for Russia, of course, not to be under sanctions. It would be good for Europe if Russia were not interfering in Ukraine and in certain other ways. And of course, it would be good for the United States if Russia and China were not collaborating quite as closely. But as with Iran, once you get into one of these spirals, it's very hard to unwind it. It's very hard to get out of it without appearing that you're giving in to a rival, that you're compromising with a potentially dangerous country. Bottom line here is I think Russia will be a major player in world politics, but not nearly as important as the United States or China. And if we were smart, we would be looking for ways to try and improve the relationship with Russia instead of blaming all of our problems on Russia and simply driving them closer to China.
There's another interesting question, Cold War ended in 1990 with the collapse of Soviet, but there are lots of discussion in this part of the world of the possibility of second Cold War between China and the United States. How do you look at it?
Well, it depends a little bit on what one means. I think the analogy to the old Cold War isn't quite right for a number of reasons. It's not nearly as intense an ideological conflict, for example. Soviet-style Marxism-Leninism was really a sort of crusading impulse. They had an empire of their own. They courted allies all over the world, etc. And they were a military peer of the United States, although I think they were always somewhat weaker. And of course, we had very little economic relationship at all with Russia or with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The Soviet bloc and the Western bloc really didn't trade with each other hardly at all. That's all very different when we're dealing with China. The two societies have been much more tightly connected. China is going to have an economy roughly the size of ours, eventually probably larger. And that was never the case of the Soviet Union. So Cold War, the comparison with the Cold War is sort of an obvious one, but there are many differences as well. The place where the phrase New Cold War, I think, does have some meaning or might be useful is to highlight that this is going to be a significant competition for influence, where each side is going to try to improve its position vis-a-vis the other. We're going to try to recruit other countries to our side. We may try to win over some friends of the other side to improve our position as well. So there's going to be a lot of intense competition here, but like the Cold War, we have to hope that it doesn't become hot. We have to hope that this doesn't lead to a direct military clash between the United States and China, which would be disastrous, it seems to me, for both sides, as well as for other countries that might get caught in the middle of that. So, as with the Cold War, a really important goal here would be to keep a competitive relationship from becoming too hot, too dangerous, and eventually crashing over into an open conflict, something that the Soviet Union and the United States did manage to avoid for 45 years.
There are two very interesting questions. One is, will there be any difference in the world order if Democrats win the election in November? And there's another question that if COVID-19 cannot be defeated, can it trigger World War III?
Could you repeat the second question, please?
If COVID-19 cannot be defeated, will there be third World War among the states?
Okay. I think that I'd say two things about the presidential election. I believe if you see Biden is elected and becomes president, you will certainly see a shift away from the unilateralism of the Trump administration, certainly the contempt he has shown for many American traditional allies, not just differences, but real contempt as well. So there's going to be very much a change in diplomatic style. But I don't think you're going to see a return to the policies of 2015, 2016 in every particular way. A Biden administration is going to be pretty confrontational towards China. It may even be more effective at getting other countries to help us or align up with us vis-a-vis China. That's one of the weaknesses, it seems to me, of Trump's approach as well. A Biden administration may try to restart the nuclear deal with Iran or negotiate a new one, but it's not going to suddenly embrace Iran. It's not going to abandon other Middle East allies and suddenly, recognize Iran. I believe Biden administration will try to get along well with Europe, but will focus most of its attention on Asia, not on Europe, because Europe is not as critical an interest as it was before. And I think a Biden administration is not going to go back to the kind of all-out globalization that you saw, say, under the Clinton administration before the emergence of this backlash against that. So in many respects, the style of American foreign policy is going to be dramatically different. I hope it will be a much more competent administration than the Trump administration has been, but it's not like we're going to do a complete reversal and go back in the other direction with great enthusiasm. If COVID is not defeated, what does that mean for the prospects of World War III? In a funny way, I actually think it makes World War III less likely. The last thing any country that is dealing with a pandemic needs is to be at war. And in particular, if you think about it, given how contagious this disease is, putting troops together in close proximity and then expecting them to actually be able to fight effectively when many of them are likely to get sick, et cetera, is the last thing you would want to do. So, if there are some small benefits to a global pandemic, and there aren't very many, but if there are some small benefits, is actually, I think, an impediment to serious international conflict as long as we are dealing with it.
We still have 5 to 7 minutes, so we want to make best use of it.
But you have about 4.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm sorry, but I have another appointment right after this. So.
Okay, so this is the last question. Professor Walt, since you talked about power transition from West to East, how do you see China's role in growing its influence in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Middle East?
One of the things that I think people have to recognize about China, and this is another contrast with the old Cold War, is that the Soviet Union did not have significant economic ties outside the Soviet bloc. It had close relations with Eastern Europe, to some degree with China economically early on, but by and large, it didn't interact very much economically with the rest of the world. It was more or less autarkic. China is quite different. China is trading, of course, around the world. It's investing around the world, and it depends on resources from around the world, on food, on energy, water, various things like that. Its economy depends upon being engaged with others. when major powers have economic ties in various places, they usually want to have some political influence in those places as well. Over time, China is going to want to have a voice in what happens in the Middle East. It will want to have a voice in what happens in parts of Africa. It will want to have a voice in South Asia, Southeast Asia, etc., possibly even in the Western Hemisphere, in Latin America as well. And again, this is not me accusing China of doing anything bad. This is what major powers inevitably do, just the way others have done. But that means that China is going to be a major diplomatic player and probably over time an increasing military player in different parts of the world upon which it is dependent. And that is something that the countries in all of those regions are going to have to take seriously and figure out how they want to respond to it, how they want to deal with it. Do they want to embrace it, welcome it, or do they want to put limits on it in various ways? I believe, depending very much on exactly how China chooses to engage with others in other parts of the world, that will determine whether other countries welcome its influence or are leery of it and concerned about it and want to take defensive measures to limit it in certain ways. But I think it's very unlikely that China is going to continue to develop economically and not also at the same time try to enhance its political influence around the world.
Thank you, Professor, for your time. We really learned a lot and it was really interesting discussion. We are really grateful for your time. We still have lots of questions, but we don't have time. Thank you so much for your encouragement and support. To formally propose vote of thanks, I would like to request Paki.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Distinguished speaker, Chair, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the session, and it is my honor to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of NICE to all those who have graced us with their presence today. First of all, we would like to express our gratitude and sincere thanks to our guest, Professor Stephen Walt, for his time and wonderful presentation. Our sincere thanks also goes to the Chair, Dr. Jaiswal, our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and the wonderful audience, of course. We're truly honored to have you all with us this evening and hope to stay connected with you in future as well. It's really been a pleasure. We will be sharing this video on YouTube channel, NIICE Nepal as well. Please subscribe to the channel and share it on your social media. It was a great evening with all of you. Thank you so much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Those were wonderful questions, by the way. Thank you.